There have been many X-Men movies over the years, but there's one in particular that's pretty unique. It kind of stands out, and it is often overlooked, and that movie would be X-Men First Class. This video contains spoilers. Before I hop into the review, keep in mind this is all just my opinion. Share in the comment section down below what you think of this movie. And without any further ado, let's hop right into it. So what I really like about this movie is kind of the historical setting that it takes place in. I just kind of like when superhero movies are also kind of historical fiction.
War never changes.
And so this movie here mainly takes place in the 1960s, where the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on, and some of the story kind of connects to that. And then of course you even have the flashbacks kind of at the beginning of the film that take place during World War II. Just plot-wise, I think this movie is done very well, as it explores Professor X making his first class, and it's also an origin for Magneto. I will say this though, as good as the story is, there are some plot holes created here with the X-Men continuity, because even before they kind of changed the timeline in Days of Future Past, movies like this were kind of contradicting other movies, and I think it's just kind of one of those deals where the filmmakers decided, hey, we want to make our movie this way, this is what we want to do with the story, even though some flashbacks from some of the other movies say otherwise. We're just going to hope people forget about those because this is what we want to do moving forward. But regardless of all that, this movie is a nice dive into these characters. So of course you have James McAvoy playing Charles Xavier, aka Professor X, and you have Michael Fassbender playing Magneto. And in the original X-Men trilogy, they were played by Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, and those were pretty much perfect casting, so I can't really say that these new actors are better, but I mean, they're just perfect as the younger versions of these characters. I don't know if any other movie has done a better job of making younger versions of certain characters actually feel like the same character. But they also feel different enough in the right way where they feel a little bit more human and relatable. And so this movie kind of dives into what makes them tick, and since they are younger, they're not as mature, you can definitely see those seeds being planted into making them the characters they wind up being in those later films, even though they're actually earlier films because they came out first, but they're later on the timeline. And so just when it comes to being a prequel in that sense, it just absolutely nails that, although it messes up some of the stuff on the timeline story-wise. But I mean, hey, what it gets right with Professor X and Magneto is the most important thing. And even though Magneto is a villain and he does bad things in later movies, this just does a great job of making you feel sorry for him and understanding why he does the things he does, because he was just treated so badly as a kid. And even though there's a point in this movie where he's very friendly with Professor X and the students of the class, you can just tell that he's ultimately going to make the evil decisions, and that's kind of what he does at the end of the film.
I've been at the mercy of men just following orders. Never again.
But as I said, you just kind of feel bad for him and you understand why he's doing what he's doing. And I just think Kevin Bacon does a great job in his role as the main villain. He feels intimidating. Of course, in this movie, Mystique plays a huge role into the story. And it's an interesting case where in the original X-Men trilogy, she was kind of one of Magneto's henchmen, but you didn't really know too much about her backstory. She didn't have character development. But in this case, she does. I also really enjoyed Nicholas Hoult as Beast in here. And I thought it was nice how he wasn't all blue and furry at the beginning of the film, because in the original X-Men comics he really wasn't. He just kind of had big feet, and that's pretty much how he is originally here. But then as he experiments and tries to stop his mutation, he just ends up making it worse, causing him to look more monstrous. And so I just thought that actually was really cool because they made him comic accurate in both his original and modern design. But aside from Mystique and Beast, the rest of this first class here is actually pretty forgettable, which the filmmakers were kind of in a pickle here because they couldn't use all the super good memorable characters like Cyclops and Wolverine because they were already used in the later movies, and that would really mess the timeline up. Although Wolverine does have a small cameo in here that does not mess with the timeline at all, because we know from X-Men Origins Wolverine what he was doing during this time period. But as I was saying, the rest of this first class here is not too memorable. Then you have the character Darwin, who has like the coolest powers where he can adapt to anything, basically meaning he could survive anything and he can't die, and he's the first character who ends up dying.
You serious?
And so everyone always likes to make fun of that scene, and I was thinking that maybe because Sebastian Shaw was better trained with his powers, he would have been able to kill Darwin, because even though his power is to adapt to survive, he couldn't adapt to survive fast enough because he just wasn't as experienced. Of course, you could make the counter argument that he's supposed to adapt to be able to adapt better. Let's just say the scene is confusing and move on. So when it comes to the action in this movie, it's pretty exciting, it's pretty good, but for a comic book movie, for an X-Men movie, it's not too heavy on action. As a matter of fact, mostly throughout the movie, it's just kind of these small little battles. It's like not traditional fighting because people have these mutations, and they just kind of do unique stuff with that. But there's really nothing large in scale until you get to the final battle. But other than that, it's not too crazy on the action. Not that I necessarily have a problem with that. For the story they're going for, it does make sense. Although I will say, kind of in the middle of the movie, it's like really light on the action. There's hardly any of it, and it does feel like a little bit too slow paced kind of in the middle there. Now, this is a movie that I feel like does not overuse CGI. And when it does use that CGI, I don't really have a problem with it. There's nothing in particular that I thought just looked really bad. The costume design is also pretty good, as well as a lot of the makeup design. And I especially liked in the final battle how the characters had yellow and blue suits, because those are the classic colors for the X-Men that they were too scared to use in the original movies.
What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
Although, of course, in this case, they don't have like the big X on it. They don't go all out in the design. But I thought it was nice enough for the beginner suits. And then I also thought the locations that they filmed that were pretty unique. You can just tell that they put the budget here to good use. So when it comes to the theme music from this movie, it's not as good as the theme from the original X-Men movies or X-Men Days of Future Past, but it's still very good in and of itself. I think it's up there with those themes, and overall probably one of the greatest comic book movie scores of all time. So overall, this movie is pretty serious, but there are some lighthearted, funny moments here and there, but mostly just banter between certain characters, but it doesn't lean into the comedy too much, and I'm perfectly okay with that. A lot of the comic book movies nowadays are just way too over the top when it comes to comedy, and so I always appreciate a movie like this. So overall, this is a comic book movie that is pretty unique. It's pretty well made. It works very well on many different levels, but mainly a character level when it comes to our main characters, not really the actual class. In that sense, it is a little bit forgettable. But just overall, I thought the film was really well made, except for the contradictions to other X-Men movies. But that's mainly just a problem with how they handled this universe, and not so much on the actual movie itself. And I also gotta say, this is the movie that ended the trend of the X-Men movies going downhill in quality, because X-Men The Last Stand was a really underwhelming conclusion to the X-Men trilogy that just had some pretty bad execution, and then X-Men Origins Wolverine just had some of the absolute worst ideas for any comic book movie ever that I just can't even fathom how that movie was greenlit. So that means between X2 and this movie, there were 8 solid years with no good X-Men movie, and so since this finally broke that trend, I mean, that's just really cool. So overall, on the quality scale of 0 to 100, I'll give it an 82%, and I would definitely recommend it if you're a fan of X-Men. Again, let me know in the comment section down below what you think of this movie. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.